Hello and thanks for joining me for some more landscape photography. In this video I'll be taking you along to one of my local beaches for an hour on a sunny winter's afternoon. But first, just a quick look at an image that I captured since my last video out on one of my dog walks. This was taken in Newborough Forest, and what caught my eye in particular, apart from of course the layers of the mountains around Rhosneigr, is the nice diagonal shaft of light that leads you out of the forest and into the scene. Now, a bit of a challenge for a micro four thirds sensor, this one, obviously with a dynamic range, but also avoiding noise in those deep shadows. Okay, so that's us caught up. Let's head off down to the beach. So I'm just having a lazy Sunday afternoon down at my local beach. To be honest, it's quite nice to be down here with a tripod and no dog, because I often see stuff that I like to shoot, but when I'm dog walking, it's kind of difficult. She gets a bit fed up if I take a tripod and keep her hanging about too much. Anyway, I've got some quite bright sunlight to work with, but it's dropping down towards the horizon, so we're just nudging into golden hour. I think we'll get much of that because it's going to drop down behind a cloud bank, so there won't be anything to speak of in sort of sunset terms, but it's kind of easy to work with this sort of light. What I've got in mind is to find a little rocky outcrop and go for some wave action, because it's not blustery at all, but there's enough movement in the sea at this high tide, just as it's on the ebb from slack water. Lovely little outcrop of rocks that I know quite well. Should lend itself to isolating one or two rocks and then just timing some shots as the waves crash around them, chuck a bit of spray up in the air, all that sort of thing. So I think this little outcrop here will work quite well. What I'm going to do is set myself a good way back from it, probably 50 meters or so. By getting this close to it, I can't get the angle I want. I want to be coming across obliquely so that I've got side light on it from further down the beach. So I've got a bag full of prime lenses with me. I'm talking to you on a 9mm. I've got a 12, 17, 25, 45 and a 75. I think probably going to be using the 75 for this one, so I am going to be quite a long way back in order for me to get the angle that I need. Now at this point I was sharing some particularly erudite thoughts on technique and composition, despite which I wasn't bright enough to switch the microphone on. So let me just run you through my memories of what I might have been saying in this sequence. Firstly, I was extolling the virtues of having a telephoto lens for this sort of photography. If you get too close to your subject on the coastline, you will always get sea spray on your lens. So if you can get back from your subject, you can still get the drama that you want, because of course you're pulling the subject in and compressing the scene anyway. I had the lens set at f2.8. I didn't have it wide open because coming in a stop just makes it at its sharpest point. That gave me a shutter speed of 1/2000 at ISO 200. And my deliberate ploy was to drop the foreground of the bit of beach that I had at the bottom of the frame into soft focus and then lead you across to where the rocks and the waves break in will be nice and sharp. And then all it meant was that with my remote shutter, enjoying the scene and just timing it every time a likely looking wave came rolling up to the rocks. what I've done with this composition is that I've deliberately left quite a large block of sky, which under normal circumstances you wouldn't do because it's offering absolutely nothing to the image. However, what you've got to bear in mind is that the shots that I'm using where the waves are hitting the rock are throwing spray up into that section of the frame, and so I want to be able to use that, so it's not dead space, it's there for a reason. I've had a fabulous hour here on the beach. I think I'm all done now though. Probably got about 500 or 600 frames to wade through. Probably pull together 2 or 3 to blend up to make the final image. But why don't I take you back, put it on the computer and show you how I bring it all together. Well, now I mentioned that I thought I might have a few hundred images to wade through, and actually when I got back, to my horror, I had 2,634. Now, I managed to eventually whittle them down to 3 frames that I plan to use to bring my main image together. This first one here is what I'm going to use for the wave, and for this wave here in the midground and some of this white water lying over the beach. This image, I'm going to use this bottom corner here because I like that there's a bit of sand in it and it's nice and softly blurred out. And then this image, I'm only going to use this little curl of water here because I want to just create a little bit of differentiation in the final composition from the main wave as it hits the rock. So here we are in Photoshop. I've aligned the images and you can see I've got 2 masks here. So if I activate this first mask, you'll see that it now brings in that little curl there. And I've also masked out all of the foreground from that first one. And then with this one, you can see as I've masked off the bottom to reveal the image underneath, which is this bit of beach here. Now, one thing that's really important to note, this little highlight here on this stone down at the bottom, I'm going to crop that off very slightly at the bottom because I don't want that highlight right on the edge of the frame. It'll be too distracting. And then I take the image back into Lightroom to do the global edits. Now this is all pretty standard stuff for Lightroom. Just a couple of things worth noting. I have dropped the highlights quite a lot more than I normally would because this upper area here with the wave was very highly exposed. It wasn't clipped at all, but I needed to work on making it stand out from the background sky. Also, vibrance and saturation. I've lifted the vibrance a little bit. The reason I do that is because the difference between vibrance and saturation is quite important. What vibrance does is it lifts saturation on colours that aren't highly saturated to meet the ones that are. In other words, it sort of balances out the saturation. And then I take the whole lot back a little bit so it doesn't look silly. So now I take that globally processed image back into Photoshop for the final edits, and in the end I didn't really have to do very much to this at all. So I create a duplicate layer from my background layer, change it to a smart object, and on this layer I've applied my Topaz denoise. I just use the basic settings every time. I find it works really well. And also, I don't do any further sharpening later on. I find that I don't need to do any output sharpening. So then what I do is I merge these layers up onto another layer, convert that to a smart object, and this layer brings in my contrast. Now that's normally the only main contrast that I do globally. I'll do dodging and burning as you'll see. But I find that Color Effects Pro 4 with my favourite recipe using Pro Contrast and Polarization blended together works really well, and you'll find that on just about everything that I share. Now it's worth noting on this layer has had the opacity dialed down to 80%. A standard procedure that I do is I overcook things deliberately and then just bring the opacity down a little bit until it's just right. And I find that's easier than mucking about with the recipes or whatever transformation that I'm applying to the image. So the next layer up is blended up from everything underneath, and that's important to note. I don't use a completely non-destructive workflow. So once I've set a layer in and then blended it up, I can't go back to a lower layer and tweak it unless I'm prepared to blend it back up. So I'm quite careful as I go along, but it does gradually build it up, kind of like adding paint onto a canvas. So I've converted this layer to a smart object, and what I've done there is I've applied just a little bit of fill light into these rocky areas to bring out some more of the shadows. I find that the fill light filter on Viveza 3 is far less aggressive than just bringing the shadows up in Lightroom, so it still retains the contrast that I want whilst bringing out the detail. So the next layer up is much more work. I've merged it all up, converted to a smart object, and on this layer I've done all of my dodging and burning with Camera Raw filter. And that was all it took to bring together an image that I'm pretty happy with. I think that the decision to shoot it at 75mm with a wide aperture to soften the foreground works quite well. It pushes the rocks away, but with the compression from the telephoto aspect of the lens, you're still kind of quite close into the details. So I think it works pretty well, and I'm happy with the final edit. Now, as it happens, I packed up my video camera and I did hang around for another hour or so on the beach. I sat on a rock eating a snack. And as the sun started to drop towards that bank of cloud, the sky coloured up quite early, so I didn't have to wait till sunset. So this image is one that I grabbed round about 45 minutes before sunset at a quarter of a second, and I was using the built-in NDs. And I got a couple more as well, which I'll put up for you at the end of this video. So all in all, a really productive and very enjoyable afternoon. But I hope you found that interesting. I hope that if you are trying to get to grips with Seascapes, it might have given you a few pointers. I'm going to leave it there for this one. Thank you ever so much for joining me. I really hope you've enjoyed it. And if you have, why not subscribe and join me next time? Cheers.